More than 110 years ago, the so-called unsinkable Titanic sank to the bottom of the sea, taking with it many of its passengers. It's one of the world's most catastrophic maritime events outside of wartime, with more than 1,500 deaths. It's also a fascinating story, one that hooked a man by the name of James Cameron and lured him on for years, until he finally decided to make one of cinema's greatest masterpieces. Think you already know everything about the story and movie of Titanic? Well, maybe not. Did you know that several dozen people were poisoned on set during filming? Or that James Cameron has a seriously wild side? Or how about the fact that many of the characters seen in the film are actually based on real people? Or that the historical catastrophe could have actually been avoided? Sit down and buckle your seatbelts, because today we're going to be talking about how James Cameron went about making a cinematographic masterpiece about the most well-known shipwreck of all time. We'd be remiss in starting this video with anything other than a bit of background on the true story of the Titanic, and we think you'd be actually pretty surprised to find out what really sunk the ship. It all started in 1907, when the Titanic was built to compete with a few other luxury liners already out there, like the Mauretania and the Lusitania, the latter of which would meet with a similarly tragic fate. Lord William James Parry, an associate at the shipbuilding company Harland and Wolff in Belfast, and Joseph Bruce Ismay, the head of the White Star Line Maritime Company, together decided to build a series of 3 luxury liners: the Olympic, the Britannic, and the Titanic, which would all surpass each other's in terms of comfort, safety, and elegance. And we have to say, it was quite the competition. At the head of operations was Alexander Montgomery Carlisle, the director of shipbuilding. And remember that name, it's going to be key to our story, because not long after construction of the 3 ships began, something happened which would change the course of their history. Carlisle retired. What may seem like a minor detail was in fact one of the things that led to the future catastrophe. But why did Carlisle retire so suddenly? His withdrawal was provoked by a meeting between Lord Parry, Ismay, and Carlisle, a meeting in which they debated the number of lifeboats to be available on the forthcoming ships. You can see where this is going, right? Carlisle, the architect, wanted 66 lifeboats on board, while the others argued that the exceptional quality of the ship's watertight compartments made of the number of lifeboats unnecessary. Kind of mind-boggling that a security measure put in place to save human lives would be so unnecessary. But hindsight 2020, I guess. Carlisle, though, had his doubts. He insisted that anything constructed by humans couldn't be completely unsinkable. In the end, though, the team rejected Carlisle's call for 66 lifeboats, sticking with just 20. 20 lifeboats for 2,000 ship occupants, which, yeah. Faced with the rejection of his concerns, Carlisle understandably resigned. Construction of the ships wrapped up without Carlisle, and on paper, it was a great success. The Titanic was an exceptional ship. We'll give you a look at some of the photographs of its ballrooms and berths, which were truly epic. The Titanic offered comfort and luxury that were absolutely unrivaled at the time. The first-class facilities included a gym, smoking lounge, restaurant, cafe veranda, pool, Turkish baths, reading room, and even a covered walkway. It was a veritable floating paradise. Honestly, you put me there and I'm staying. D-Day arrived in April of 1912. The ship's maiden voyage was set for the 10th. She'd leave the port of Southampton and set out for New York. On board were some of the richest people on the planet, including Colonial Archibald Gracie and Archibald Butt. Archibald was apparently the trendiest name at the time. There were also several important businessmen, but not everyone on board the ship was vastly wealthy. There were also hundreds of people immigrating from Great Britain, from Ireland, and elsewhere in Europe, all hoping to find a better life in the United States. On April 10th, 1912 at 12:15 p.m., the Titanic left Southampton in England, carrying on board 953 passengers and 889 crew members. The ship made stops at Cherbourg and at Queenstown, where she picked up more passengers for a grand total of 1,324 passengers and 889 crew members. But just how did such an apparently foul-proof voyage turn so disastrous? As it turns out, things started going wrong from almost the very beginning. On April 12th, 1912 at 7:45 p.m., just 2 days after the departure, the Titanic received a call reporting upcoming dense fog, a thick layer of ice, and icebergs in the North Atlantic. Not a great start. During the day on April 13th, 1912, the Titanic received still more messages, again warning of upcoming icebergs and sheaves of ice. And during the night of April 14th, the ship received yet again warnings about ice ahead. After 2 full days of alarming messages, you've got to admit, things are getting pretty hairy. We'd be remiss in not pointing out that the situation was unlucky from the get-go. Icebergs in this region in April are extremely rare, but that's not all. The night was also exceptionally dark, with no moon, and in a highly unlucky twist of events, there were no binoculars that night in the crow's nest with which to watch the horizon. Locating upcoming icebergs was nigh impossible. It was almost a perfect storm for the unfortunate conditions. But it was all about to get a lot worse. The Titanic received a final message on April 14th at 10:55 p.m., just before things went catastrophically wrong. A crucial message from a ship navigating ahead, informing them that they'd have to stop due to icebergs. But the wireless operator working the telephone didn't listen and passed the message on to the bridge, responding, "Keep out and shut up." A fatal mistake. Less than an hour later, Titanic struck the iceberg, the shock of which tore its metal siding, ripping rivets and tearing open a catastrophic leak in its hull below the surface. Water began to flood in and the disaster had begun. But why did the collision cause such catastrophic damage? Multiple reasons. For one, the ship's watertight compartments had actually been placed too low during its construction in order to leave room for that infamous covered walkway. For another, the supposedly steel rivets were actually wrought iron because of a steel shortage during construction. To make matters worse, the ship was actually traveling at a higher than usual speed at the time of the collision. It all led to a series of disastrous decisions due to negligence or ego, which eventually caused horrific mayhem and death. At this point, people on board were panicking. Officers began loading passengers, with women and children getting priority into the lifeboats, while also privileging those traveling in first or second class. But even at full capacity, the lifeboats would only have been able to hold 1,178 passengers, and there were more than 2,000 people on board. Remember that one guy who wanted Titanic to be loaded with 66 lifeboats? Yeah. What's more, most of the lifeboats were being lowered into the surface of the ocean half empty. So the whole catastrophe was not just caused by an iceberg, but also by a series of horrifically bad decisions taken months or even years ahead of the Titanic's fateful voyage. I mean, I'm not saying that I could have handled things better, but I can at least keep my pasta water from boiling over. I mean, I'm just pointing out some facts here. The end result was catastrophic. Some 1,500 deaths for just 700 survivors. The crew was hit especially hard. 76% of the Titanic's crew members died in the event. The third-class passengers, too, suffered greatly. 75% of the people traveling in third class died in the wreck. So what happened next? Just how did this epic drama become the cinematic masterpiece we all know and love? James Cameron had always been fascinated by the story of the Titanic. He had already made a documentary on icebergs, and now he had decided to make a film about the sinking of the ship. And Cameron, of course, wasn't about to do things halfway. During the making of the film, he dived down 12 times to the wreck on the seafloor. Those dives allowed for the capturing of the exterior and interior images of the wreck at a depth of some of 12,500 feet. At the time, no equipment would have been able to make a journey to that depth, but Cameron and his crew managed to film using a camera that his brother had specifically made. Tons of work went into the making of this movie. Even before Cameron directed and produced it, he even edited a part of the film himself. The film got off the ground with a budget of $200 million. That's more than the whole Titanic herself. James Cameron even denied taking his $8 million salary, but that wasn't the only epic amount of effort that went into making this film. To film the exterior views of the ship, the filmmakers crafted a life-size model, almost 900 feet long and over 90 feet wide. We'll give you a look about how that stacks up. One small thing though, on the real Titanic, passengers boarded on the left, but the film's model ship had passengers boarding on the right. I mean, nobody would have noticed, right? Wrong. When Cameron realized that it would be impossible to recreate the massive model, he required that everyone on it down to the text and writing would be done backwards so that the image could be flipped horizontally during the video editing process and the passengers would be boarding on the correct side. For the interior of the ships, models were crafted to scale at 1/4 and 20th of the real Titanic's original size. Cameron, ever the perfectionist, wanted everything to be exactly identical, from the ship's decor to its lifeboats, which were ordered from the same company that had built the original ones back in 1912. Okay. I know that you're wondering, if this is a model, where's the water? And I've got an answer for you. The movie was actually filmed in 3 massive basins, the largest of which held almost 23 million gallons of water. The largest basin was used for filming the exterior of the ship. The mid-sized one was used to film the scenes in which the interior of the ship floods, and the smallest basin was used for filming the ship's passengers in the water. Like, for example, that infamous scene on the board. We should note that filming in this fashion was a pretty big risk. The scene in which the dome explodes, for example, had to be done in one single take, and this scene cost $1 million, and which showed off the ship in all her splendor and using a lot of different special effects. A model made to 1/8 scale was used to show the scene in which the ship breaks in two. Its end was detachable and could incline to 90 degrees for that iconic moment when we see the characters falling from the ship into the water below. Hold on, you mean Cameron was just hurling people over a 90-degree edge? Okay, no, calm down. The slides were done by stunt people on a slope that was much less steep, except they also added little wheels to the backs of the stunt people so that when they rolled down, it'd be even faster. Fully iconic. Sure, that scene in which people are slamming into things is pretty hardcore. All right, yes, they were really slamming into things, but most of that decor we see in that scene was made of rubber. I mean, they've got to cut back on those hospital visits, am I right? At this point, you're probably saying to yourself, that's all great, but to film a large-scale views of the 900-foot ship, they must have been using, like, special effects, right? Wrong again. The filmmakers actually brought in a massive crane right on set. That said, there was a ton of work in post-production to put in special effects to combine the shots of the model with those of the interior of the ship and with the shots of the actors performing in front of a green screen. This was also one of the first movies to use motion picture capture for some seriously complex stunts. It all included a big mix of miniatures, special effects, and CGI, and which meant that Cameron was able to craft an incredible movie, which is highly realistic for the time period, and which I personally think has aged stunningly well. Knowing what you now do know about just how hardcore Cameron was about making this film, you won't be surprised to learn about the filming conditions and how hardcore they were as well. The water temperature in the basins, for example, were a chilly 57 degrees Fahrenheit, and Kate and Leo were not wearing wetsuits. Cameron insisted everything look as realistic as possible, and realistic it definitely was. Kate Winslet even had a bout of hypothermia once during filming. Many of the scenes were also highly complex to film, which made all the shooting super exhausting. James Cameron was so difficult to work for that at one point an extra did something that I've never heard of ever before. On the last day of filming, he poisoned the crew and 56 people ended up in the hospital, including Cameron. Of course, the smashing success of the film is also attributable to, at least in part, the two main actors. The chemistry between Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio is just undeniable. After the film's release, the two said that the fact that they got along so well helped so much to bring their characters and their relationship to life. You might think that a sentimental love story in a movie based on a tragic real-life event might be too much, but it really does feel like Rose and Jack's story holds such a true to its own unique story. Society was even more stratified than now, and the Titanic was a ship on which people from different classes actually did cross paths. We know that the ship's first-class passengers were given priority at the moment of the disaster, and in this film, Cameron shows us a love story which breaks down the social barriers and classes. So with all that we've talked about, the massive budget, the crazy stunts, the adaptation of a potentially mushy love story into an epic historical drama, you better believe that there was a lot of negativity in the press ahead of this movie's release. It's crazy to think now, at the time, people actually expected this movie to flop. Okay, so here is an extract from a critic at the Los Angeles Times. "For seeing Titanic almost makes you weep in frustration, not because of the excessive budget, not even because it requires recalls the unnecessary loss of life in the real 1912 catastrophe, which saw more than 1,500 of the 2,200 plus passengers dying when an iceberg sliced the ship open like a can opener. What really brings on the tears is Cameron's insistence that writing this kind of movie is within his abilities. Not only isn't it isn't even close. Kenneth Turner, Los Angeles Times, December 19th, 1997. In spite of all that, though, the film was a successful, massive hit. I mean, James Cameron managed to bring so much magic to the screen, both from the love story between Jack and Rose, and I mean, we all cry every time they're on screen. Like, don't lie, you know we all do. It brings us all together. And in the unbelievable realistic decor and special effects, Cameron brought the realism to extreme lengths, even down to including background characters based on real-life Titanic passengers. My personal favorites are the elderly couple, Ida and Isidore, who decide to perish together, leaving their place in the lifeboats to women and children. Even crazier, amongst the descendants of Isidore and Ida is Wendy, the wife of one of the victims of the recently lost Titan submersible. Coincidence? Maybe. James Cameron himself spoke about the wreck of the Titan and noting the troubling similarities between the two dramatic events. Besides, of course, their final resting place, many warnings went ignored, and importantly, the Titan, like the Titanic, was an experimental vehicle made of less sturdy materials than traditional submersibles or ships. So what do you think? Is experiencing such an incredible, exceptional, epic event worth the massive amount of risk? Let us know in the comments below.
Absolutely. There was a grand plan. I had it all planned perfectly. No, look, every film evolves. It's the sum total of all the artistic intentions of the people that work on it. You know, I couldn't have planned what James Horner wrote as the score, but that's part of what gets us, the chemistry between Kate and Leo, and the beauty of the sets and all that. I mean, we just all got to participate in something that came out pretty damn good, you know, and I'm happy about that.
Absolutely. I mean, Kate to me is such, I've seen her performances in the past, and I knew her work, and she sort of knew mine, and we immediately appreciated working with each other. It was incredible, and we got along just like that, and I think it worked for the movie for sure. Absolutely. I mean, I wasn't there for the whole sick thing, but I heard great stories. I mean, it seemed sort of out of control. People started doing the conga line and whatnot unawareingly. But, you know, as far as the filmmaking experience goes, we went through the widest spectrum of things you could go through, and such a long, it took a lot of endurance and took a lot of focus to be there for that long and to stay in character. What the most interesting part was that sort of all the elements that were in the film meshed together and actually made a whole film. You know, you have the stunts, the computer-generated stuff, the ship, and, you know, this sort of intimate story between two people, and to see all these things sort of come together and you watch it on screen, it's amazing. I mean,
it's best not to think about it at the time. No, I mean, it's like being an astronaut. You've got all your procedures, you know what you're supposed to do, and you know, because I co-designed the sub, I knew how it was going to work, and we had tested everything. So, you know, it's not quite as risky as it sounds if you've done your engineering properly.